Welcome to Spinning Back Clique, the MMA Junkie weekly roundtable show where we discuss the latest news and notes in the sport. It is April 10th, and I am your host, Mike Bond, here to guide you through the latest episode and one of my favorite times in the sport, the Monday after a big UFC pay-per-view, guys. It doesn't get any better than this. Joining me on the panel this week, we have Danny Segura down there in Florida, was just covering UFC 287 for us on site in Miami, did a great job. And then, of course, both the boys from MMA Junkie Radio, Gorgeous George and the Goes. Hope everyone is doing well. Let's get things started, boys, shall we? Topic one, Israel Adesanya finally exercised his demons on Saturday in the UFC 287 main event, knocking out Alex Pereira in the second round to reclaim the UFC middleweight title, vanquishing his personal boogeyman and making history as the first two-time UFC middleweight champion. Danny, you were cage side for this fight, so I want you to tell me first, what was your reaction to the main event? And I want to know how regaining the title impacts Adesanya's legacy. He has now beaten every middleweight in the UFC's official rankings, top five, some of them twice, and got the thorn out of his side, and it is Pereira. So give us your thoughts on how this unfolded and how the win impacts Izzy's legacy.
Yeah, when it first happened, I don't want to say the word shocked because we knew that this was a possibility, right? Whenever you put the level of strikers that these two guys are, I mean, anything can happen. A knockout can happen at any given time. But I remember looking around the arena and people, it was such a big result, I think, that people were just kind of taking it all in, and it took a bit to process because Israel Adesanya, to be honest here, he was fighting for his legacy. He had more at stake here than Alex Pereira. And I understand that Alex Pereira had the belt, so technically he would lose something physical, something that Israel Adesanya wouldn't because he entered this fight as a challenger, not a champion. But beyond just the hardware, I mean, he was fighting for something much bigger, Israel Adesanya. He was fighting for his legacy. Not so long ago, we were talking about him stepping on the heels of Anderson Silva and almost becoming, the GOAT at 185 pounds, certainly number two. And now you fast forward a few fights later, and if he would have lost a fourth to Alex Pereira, we're talking about maybe that he wasn't really the best of his era in the kickboxing, and maybe not even in MMA either, because look, this guy has 2 wins in 2 different sports over him. But that was clearly not the case. Obviously, we saw that Adesanya laid him out flat, knocked him out, and I think he didn't recover everything, but he kind of kept his legacy alive, kept his legacy a bit more intact, because a loss, again, would have been devastating. I think a loss would have vastly changed the way fans and media look at him. But now, he's back on top.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, another loss here, I think, would have been really damaging to the legacy of Israel Adesanya. So the fact he was able to get at least a slice of redemption, I know, he's still down 3-1 overall, but George, I want to throw it to you. I mean, your thoughts on this main event, and what do you think it does? Do you think we now look at Israel as the better fighter to Alex Pereira, or do you think in terms of legacy-wise with the two of them, he still has some work to do?
There's still some work to do, but, this was important for Israel Adesanya. We've seen what happens when a fighter is down 0-2 to somebody in the past. Miesha Tate to Ronda Rousey, Colby Covington to Kamaru Usman. You're just boxed into a corner where not much is happening with you until you can either get that third shot or hope somebody else wins the title, and then you ease your way back that way. And so Israel Adesanya is no longer, boxed in. And let's not forget the ability to make 10 times more than you probably make as a challenger. Now you got those pay-per-view cuts and everything else that comes with being the champion. Now, as far as the legacy is concerned, yeah, this guy wants to chase down Anderson Silva. Even though he beat him head-to-head, he beat a past his prime Anderson Silva. So to get to Anderson Silva, you got to get to those 10 title defenses. So he's halfway there. And in the modern area, we tend to give a little bit of a grading curve to these fighters. Maybe he doesn't have to get to 10, maybe he gets to 7 or 8. It all depends on what he does, right? Like you said, Mike, the ability to look at the rankings and say, well, wait a minute, this guy's wiped all of them out, some of them 2 times. That's pretty amazing. He's got a great record overall, and little by little, he's just racking up those stats. So maybe he doesn't get to 10 title defenses, and maybe one day we can call him the greatest middleweight ever. But I'm sure he wants to get to that point, and then maybe just join the GSPs of the world, the John Joneses of the world, Demetrius Johnsons, cement himself on Mount Rushmore's GOAT talk, that type of stuff. So Israel Adesanya, huge win for him. Yes, he's down 3-1. The kickboxing is just another career, but in MMA, it's 1-1. I disagree with Israel Adesanya on one thing, though. It's not settled. We need to see the trilogy at some point. Do we need to see it right away? No. But I know that's another topic that we're going to get to. But as far as what I watched on Saturday, incredible, historic. And guess what? Hats off to Alex Fajeda. A lot of us kept saying he didn't show us as much in that first fight. And I thought this fight was kind of going his way until he got checked by that big overhand right, two of them, in fact, and then that big hammer fist. Wow. I want him to recover, but at some point, man, this middleweight division is amazing. I was always on the edge of my seat in both fights. These two brought it.
Yeah, it was so impressive. I mean, Izzy doesn't really have a finish of that nature in the UFC, just something so violent and so devastating. So for him to do that, I mean, it was just utterly impressive. Goes, I guess we'll close with you for the initial thoughts. I mean, how impressed were you by this knockout? And where do you think it puts, Izzy in terms of legacy? I mean, he's done something now that Anderson Silva was unable to do against Chris Weidman when he lost that title. He got it back. And I think being able to do that is, the mark of a truly impressive champion. No middleweight has ever been able to regain the belt. So what does this do legacy-wise?
You have some fighters that look at this situation and they don't even really start to talk about legacy until later in their career. Israel Adesanya has been a guy that from day one, when he entered our studio, right around the time of his first UFC fight, he was already talking about legacy. This is something that's been on his mind. And so it was a big deal, man, for him to kind of get over this hurdle, because a loss here would have just made him a great fighter. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you want to be exceptional, right? That group of just a few fighters, and Israel Adesanya is now back on track to being there. And I thought what was so interesting about this fight was, look, I thought he was losing the fight up until that moment. But one thing he didn't do was exploit the ground game, right? Like if we go back to the last fight, I think a lot of us thought his path to victory was grappling, mixing that in with his striking. He didn't do that. He never lost focus in the fight. Although I did feel he was losing, I don't think he was panicking. And I think that's a big deal for Israel Adesanya. There's so much mental in the game for him when he's in that cage. So very, very big win for him. And I kind of agree with everyone else. I'd like to see this down the road.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first, what I want to ask you guys about is we see Israel Adesanya reveling in his victory there. But the post-fight celebration, he comes to the press conference, and as we see him in the cage, he points into the crowd and does the flop over. And then he lets us know at the press conference that he was looking for Alex Pereira's son and mimicking the celebration he did when he got knocked out in kickboxing. And this seemed to either, show people that maybe he's overly petty. He said himself that he is petty. What did you guys think? Danny, I want to ask you. Do you think this was going too far by Adesanya with the celebration here, or is it all fair game?
I mean, we're talking about a kid, right? If it was like his brother, like an adult, or like a training partner and they got beef, but we're talking about a kid, and it was clearly a traumatic experience watching his dad get knocked out. And we don't know if he's going to get up or not, right? Like we've seen deaths in combat sports. Obviously they don't happen often, but we know that like getting knocked out like that is a pretty serious thing. So to be honest, when I was hearing those words at the press conference, I was kind of like, and I was like right in front of it. Like there was very little empathy there. But again, these fighters are not regular civilians, right? They have to be kind of stone cold killers in this game. But look, the fight's over, man. Like you won, you put him out. Leave his kids out of it. But I don't know, though. That's just kind of how I feel about it. But again, they're going to do whatever they want to do. And I understand that, Adesanya, he'd been through a lot, right? He had lost to this guy 3 different times. And I'm sure not only Pereira some, but the entire world was mocking him and saying you couldn't get past him, this and that. So I'm sure that moment, and we saw in the emotion in the post-fight press conference, as well as in the cage, it was very relieving. I mean, there was a lot at stake here. But was I a fan of it? No, man. Leave the kids out of it.
Yeah, it was a little bit jarring. I guess George or Goes, either one of you think this was like an okay move with Izzy, or do you largely agree with Danny that maybe it was a little offside?
You know what? I've actually gone back and forth with this, and this is the way I look at it, guys. If I'm Alex Pereira, when my kid did that the first time, I would probably pick up the phone, talk to him, Israel Adesanya. Hey, man, I'm sorry for what my kid did. That was a little disrespectful. We didn't mean it. He's just a kid. If that happened and Israel still did what he did, I would have a bigger problem with it. If he never made that call, then yeah, I think I wouldn't say fair game, but I kind of get where Izzy's coming from. And at the end of the day, yeah, man, it is a kid, and there's so much going on, and there's so many things you have to worry about in life that if something a kid did years ago is still on your mind, it's going to be tough to be successful in life because you're going to get a lot more from other people than kids. So I guess I kind of look at it that way. I'm really kind of sort of on the fence, but I lean a little bit towards Danny. Like, what are you doing, man? It's petty. But here's the thing: Israel says he knows he's petty, so it's kind of like it's tough to argue that.
Yeah, he owned it.
I'm gonna give Izzy a yellow card. He that was just not necessary. Honestly, the KO speaks for itself. That was a kid in 2017 that did that. Yeah, maybe he's closer to being an adult now. So maybe it is more fair game. But come on, you're really hanging on to that. And Israel, along with a lot of fighters, are constantly always saying, the fans, the media, you guys turn your back. You guys can be so petty. And now you're being petty. So I don't know. I don't think it was necessary. Such a beautiful KO. Again, that speaks for itself. It's 1-1. You're the champ now. Get to hugging your people, get to your dance. I love all that stuff. Get to your celebrations, trying to hunt out a kid just to give him the message. How does he know that Alex Ojeda didn't go home and go, hey, kid, what are you doing? That was uncalled for. He doesn't know that he wasn't parented at that moment. I don't know. But still, Israel, yellow card for you, man. No, don't do that. Great performance, though.
Yeah, and mixed reactions in the comments here. Some people saying no class, some people, saying it was a W for Izzy. I think that just goes to show he's the type of guy that will hang on to the littlest moment. So I guess just beware to any future opponents, their families, whatever, how you act, you will most certainly remember it. He said,
don't cut that guy off on the road, because years later he might even the score.
Hey, but let me add one thing. Like, going forward, we've seen what happens with like Conor McGregor, right? The gloves come off. He'll say just about anything. This particular incident here, if you're a fighter and you're bringing your family in the cage, I'm not saying it's right that these things happen, but you have to know that they happen. And that's something that you have to keep in your mind going forward.
Ruthless goes out here in this episode. Fair game. Fair game. If they're in the cage, you're around it. Fair game.
I'm just saying, like, man, MMA fighters are crazy. They'll do whatever. So if you're going to bring your family in the cage, man, you just have to watch out for that.
Yeah, maybe another example of don't bring your kids to these fights. I mean, we've seen some rough moments over the past couple of years. Usman getting knocked out by Leon Edwards in front of his daughter, things like that. You need to prepare yourself for the roughest moments if you're going to bring your family into this scenario. But we got to move on, guys. Last thing on this opening topic, Israel Adesanya saying at the post-fight press conference, he doesn't want to do an immediate trilogy fight with Alex Pereira. He pretty much dismissed it, said, I put in the hard work to get to my UFC title shot. Alex Pereira got the fast track the first time around, and now it's his time to go earn it, to go beat a contender if he doesn't move up to 205, which seems to be the thinking from both Adesanya and UFC president Dana White, who said at the press conference that he thinks Pereira is moving up and pretty much brushed off the idea of doing this immediate MMA trilogy fight. So what do you guys think? Let's go to you first. I mean, is the right move to do the trilogy fight next, or should Izzy fight whomever else and Pereira either have to go back to the line and work his way up or go to a new division and start fresh?
To me, it feels like unfinished business. I can't remember a fight. I don't know what it was like for you guys, but in our room, we had 5 people in the room and it was dead silent at times. It was so intense, the situation. So for me, there's unfinished business and it has to happen. The problem is I don't think it can happen right now. It just doesn't make much sense. Let's just start with the fact that he probably needs to rest a little bit, right? But on top of that, here's where it gets tricky. If you're the UFC, if you're a business, if you want to make that third fight, you're going to have to do it now, I think. Because if you look at it from a business standpoint, I don't know that the rest of the division is a good matchup for Pereira. Will he make it back to Izzy? That could be a problem.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I want to chime in on this one. In my opinion, Israel earned it because he had defended his title 5 times, so he had the ability to ask for an immediate rematch, and I think he was a willing partner, a frequent fighter. The UFC likes that. In this case, Alex Ojeda didn't even defend it 1 time, but he is 3-1 up on Izzy if you involve all the combat sports, or 1-1, and these were good fights that ended viciously on both sides. So I think what Izzy kind of makes sense. Look, if he goes to 205, obviously the case is shut. But if he stays at 185 and beats one other fighter, I think that's a fair request. And I think it lets the division breathe as well so that we can get other people involved. You know, I saw in the chat room here, want to give them a shout out. Taco Cobb says, how about the King of Africa, Duplessis versus Israel Adesanya? Kind of makes sense. Hopefully it fits with the timeline of the UFC wanting to go to Africa. In the meantime, give Pereira to someone else. And if Pereira can't get past that someone else, whoever it may be, then I guess he's just not worthy of that trilogy. But Izzy said one word. He said it's settled. It's not settled.
Yeah, so Danny, we'll just close it out with you. I mean, obviously, I think if you do this fight, it would still be a big fight. It makes sense. It's 1-1 in MMA. Like the UFC could easily do this, but if they don't do it, tell me what's a better option for Adesanya. I mean, some people are mentioning in the comments Dricus du Plessis, who we saw the vague call out of him from Adesanya at the press conference. He wouldn't name him, but the message was very clearly directed at him, saying he's going to drag his carcass across South Africa. And obviously very heated about the things Dricus said around his last fight, being the real fighter from Africa and all that. I don't know if that's a fight that can be made right now. I think you do have to do that in Africa if you could, which I wouldn't imagine is happening in the next 4 or 5 months when Izzy does want to fight again. So you tell me, like, if Pereira is gone to 205, if he needs to take a year off to recover from this knockout, what do you do with Izzy?
Well, first of all, this is kind of like, I kind of had the same reaction and same moment where you kind of have to check yourself. Like, am I crazy? Where when Dana White said, like, yeah, Colby Covington is the next for the title shot, and it's like obvious, and you're like, wait, am I experiencing the same thing that he's experiencing? Same thing here. Like, we get Dana White at the presser saying, like, yeah, no, that's probably not going to happen. Like, kind of doesn't make sense, this and that. And then Israel Adesanya saying, yeah, it's settled. Like, why are you guys even asking me about Pereira? Like, this is done. Like, it's not. I mean, you were literally 0-3 against this guy just moments ago. You get one. He's knocked you out twice. You knock him out once, and all of a sudden it's settled? No way. I mean, a trilogy has to happen. In fact, I don't think the entire series, Combat Sports series, is resolved. And I don't think you need to fight, another 4 times to get it resolved. No, just fight one more time. The winner of that will leave as the winner of the entire series, kickboxing and MMA. But there is one fight pending. Now, I would understand Dana White and Israel Adesanya not wanting to do an immediate trilogy bout if there's tons of contenders, say like 170. You got Bilal Muhammad, you get Shafkat Rakhmonov, Burns. I mean, it's just a long line, and then you don't want to mess with the order of the division. But if we look at 185, Adesanya, going by the rankings, right below Adesanya is going to be Robert Whittaker. He's beat him twice. Below that, it's going to be Marvin Vettori. He's beat him twice. Below that, he beat Jared Cannonier once. Not in a very exciting fight. Below that, he destroyed Paulo Costa. We have to go all the way to number 6, which I assume on Tuesday when it'll get updated, it'll be maybe higher. Dricus du Plessis, who I think we all agree that perhaps is missing that one key victory in order to get a title shot. So if you're talking about a trilogy, an immediate trilogy between Alex Pereira or a fight with Dricus du Plessis, I'm going with Alex Pereira all day. That fight is the one that needs to happen. That's the fight that makes sense, and you got to make it happen almost immediately, because as you guys have mentioned, Pereira is not a young buck in this game. He's like 36 or so. I wouldn't think he's got a long time to build on a crazy win streak and then fight, I don't know, Adesanya 2-3 years down the line. I don't think that's going to happen. So you got to make the fight now. And look, I wouldn't hate it if Pereira wants to move up to 205 and then you don't make that fight because of that. But okay, that's Pereira's choice. If Pereira wants to fight him at 185, I do believe he has the right. He is 3-1 in this series. It makes sense. So again, I'm all on Team Pereira on this one in terms of who should be fighting Israel Adesanya next. But if that's definitely not an option, due to the comments that both Dana White and Adesanya made, just make a fight with Dricus du Plessis. To be honest, I don't want to see any rematch or any trilogies with guys that are 0-2 at this point against Adesanya. And there is bad blood, as you mentioned, Mike. So make Dricus du Plessis. But again, I think it's going to be a thing where whatever you choose outside of Pereira, a bunch of fans are not going to be happy because there's no ideal scenario. There's no ideal fight. Maybe even Hamzat again, but then again, so I know a group of people won't be happy saying he won't merit it. But Hamzat or Dricus du Plessis, I think those should be next if Pereira's not the guy.
Yeah, we'll see what they do. Going to be very interesting, and obviously, let's see what Alex Pereira wants. We haven't heard him speak on what he actually wants from the future as the time we are live right now. So remains to be seen. But obviously, we've taken up a lot of time with this first segment. I think it warrants it. Obviously, a huge result, huge title change, all that stuff. But let's move on to topic 2, which was the co-main event of UFC 287, which saw Jorge Masvidal suffer a unanimous decision loss to Gilbert Burns, and then announce his retirement from MMA at 38 years old on a 4-fight losing skid and just a couple months shy of the 20-year anniversary of his MMA debut. I ask you guys, was this the right time for Masvidal to retire from the sport? And how do you see his legacy as he goes out? George, I know you go way back with Mr. Masvidal, so I want you to go first and give his career some context in the aftermath of his retirement.
Back when we weren't ethical, Goes and I sponsored Jorge Masvidal when we were just Tag Radio, and then we moved to Junkie Radio and learned that it wasn't acceptable. Yeah, we do go way back. An exception was made. This was at the Playboy Mansion, so we kind of had to just get involved somehow. Anyway, Jorge Masvidal, look, he's done a lot in his career at lightweight, at welterweight. He never won a title except for the BMF title, which, by the way, was a pretty big event in itself. Shiny belt. He should be very proud of that. I think there's always been something to be said for the collection of gangsters and OGs and guys from the streets, and who really is the BMF out there. So I thought it was appropriate that Diaz and Masvidal went out, settled it. He's got a nice shiny belt to show for it. But look, aside from that, the guy's got the fastest KO ever. An amazing highlight that will live on. Any type of video montage the UFC ever produces. And he had an incredible 2019, one of the most incredible years that an athlete could have under the UFC umbrella, thus propelling him to being an actual pay-per-view superstar towards the end of his career, which was much deserved, because I think when Dana White in his mind thought, what do I want a fighter to be like? You want Jorge Masvidal, man, just some dude that just doesn't put up with anything, gets down, will fight across many divisions, and will do it, for a long time. This guy had an amazing career, and I think it's the right time for him to bow out. He was taking shots that he didn't used to take before, because he would use his great boxing skills that he had, good head movement, or he'd make you pay for some of those. He looked a little bit slower. He said it himself. That 3 ain't dropping anymore. That rifle, that he's got, it's just not hitting his wide receivers. He used those comparisons in other sports. So for right now, he exits at the right time. Now, does that mean he's done with combat sports? Probably not. I think he's definitely marketable at bare knuckle or in the low-level celebrity boxing sport that we've created, I guess, with the Paul brothers. I think he could definitely go out there and make some more money. Plus, he's doing promotions. He's got the mezcal. So good time for him to bow out of MMA. MMA steals your soul, man. And to do it for 20 years, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, his longevity was remarkable, and the fact that he was able to have the resurgence he did in year 17 and go on that 2019 run where I believe he was the MMA Junkie Fighter of the Year that year, edging out Israel Adesanya. It was, a very special run for him. But Goes, obviously, you have some of the history with Masvidal as well. What did you just think of his decision to hang up the gloves in his hometown of Miami here? It was a pretty special moment for him, even though the fight didn't go his way.
Yeah, well, for starters, George, I think we made a lot of exceptions that night at the Playboy Mansion, but we won't get into that. I think it's interesting because Jorge has been fighting a lot longer than people realize, right? Like his jump to fame in the UFC, he's been around way before that, fighting in other organizations and even fighting in the UFC and not really getting that much publicity like he's been getting the last couple of years. I actually commend him on this situation, because it is kind of the back end of his career where he's been making the big bucks, right? He has a lot of fights against quality opponents where he wasn't making that much money. And the problem that we see in mixed martial arts today is a lot of these fighters wait until that moment, that bad knockout, or they can't remember somebody's name or something to make these type of decisions. For Jorge to make it now before that moment comes, I really commend him in doing that. And you can tell that competition no longer defines him anymore, right? Like George mentioned, the mezcal. He's on the cover of a UFC video game. If we were to do kind of like an NBA-esque logo, it would probably be Masvidal's flying knee, right? That would probably be it. So based off of everything that he's been able to accomplish and the moment, I think he made a good decision in retiring. I think people are going to say he did leave some money on the table because you can match him up with just about anyone, right? But the guy knows that he probably can't win a title, and I think he just doesn't want to go out the same way some of these other fighters have. So I commend Jorge for doing this.
Yeah, already 4 losses in a row, so it was probably the time. My personal opinion goes, I think if they were to do a Jerry West type logo, it's got to be Anderson Silva's front kick on Vitor Belfort rather than the flying knee. But that's a good option too. But Danny, to close it out to you, I mean, what do you think of Masvidal's retirement and his career? Did he overachieve? Did he underachieve based on what you thought he does? I mean, as we were watching some of the B-roll there put up by Ken Hathaway, our great producer, I feel like for years I watched Masvidal and was like, man, he's just not living up to his potential. Like, it was frustrating to watch him because you knew he was so much better than what he was putting out in the octagon in a lot of these fights, but he managed to turn it on late and have that run we talked about. What do you think? Do you think he did more with less or didn't do enough? What do you think of the career in hindsight now?
That's a very tough question. And I feel like you can make an argument either way. I remember way before 2019, that crazy year that he had, I remember telling people, like, why is Jorge Masvidal not a star? Like, why is he not as famous as Nate Diaz? Because he is a very exciting fighter. He's a striker. He's got he's basically Nate Diaz, but instead of, the whole 209, he's 305. I mean, if he's like the most Miami guy person out there. I think the public really feels, the Miami public and crowd really feels identified with him in the sense of, the way how he talks, his story, his background, immigrant parents, being Hispanic, Latino. How is this guy not more famous than he is? And I think that's a question that I always wondered for a long time. I do feel like he underachieved in the sense that, and not on his fault, I feel like the promotion could have backed him way earlier into his career, and he could have been, again, a Nate Diaz-like figure with big fights, with a longer sort of superstar reign, because he only really became a superstar towards the end of his career since 2019. So, and then skill-wise, dude, we all knew how good he was, and there was so many fights, especially like he had a couple ones I'm trying to remember right now. I think it was back-to-back to Benson Henderson and Lorenz Larkin, fights that he lost by split decision. And I think there were others there too, where like a lot of people thought he won. He just wouldn't get the nod from the judges, but certainly he had a lot of bad luck there. So I guess you can make an argument for both. But certainly, he does have 17 losses on his record. But yeah, Jorge Masvidal, just a fantastic career. I'm glad that he's retiring. He's fought 52 professional times. He's rolled the dice 52 times. Leaves the MMA with money, health, fame, other business ventures. That is a career to envy. He might have not been a champion in mixed martial arts, but he is a champion in life. It's hard to walk away from this game with both money, health, success, fame, and business ventures outside of it. Usually one or several are missing, and that leads to poor retirements. But I think Jorge Masvidal played the game right, the best that he could, and here he is, a champion in life.
Yeah, agreed. And to your point there, greatest adventure in the comments says Masvidal used to be the king of split decision losses. And I think that kind of points to what I was saying there. You watched him for years there and was like, man, if he just did 5% more, he'd be winning these fights a lot more convincingly. But I mean, I wonder too, now that he is retired, where does this Leon Edwards fight rank in terms of like the greatest fights we never got that should have happened, all that stuff. But I want to go quickly around the horn since we're kind of behind on time here. Does anyone think one day Jorge Masvidal will get into the UFC Hall of Fame? We've talked about in recent weeks, the different criteria, all that stuff. Just give me a yes or a no. We'll start with George. Do you think he gets in?
Yes, I think he does. He's beaten some Hall of Famers or soon to be Hall of Famers. So that alone, the fastest KO, yes. Pay-per-view star, yes.
Danny?
Yeah, I think seeing Donald Cerrone get inducted, that kind of gives you an idea that you don't have to be a champion. And look, if we're talking about the most successful fighters without winning a belt, Masvidal has to be up there. So yeah.
Goes.
Yes.
Yes.
I'll
Okay.
play by your rules, Mike. You said
Yeah,
yes.
no, you're good. I'm curious to see if he does. I think that BMF belt and the 5-second KO might be enough on its own, but we'll have to wait and see. And last thing on this topic too, just wanted to get your guys' quick thoughts, kind of as an aside. Gilbert Burns, after this fight, accused Masvidal of using lotion and more or less greasing. Gave this whole big speech about how he did multiple showers to kind of get it into his skin, so he was slippery in the cage. Does anyone, and whoever can jump in who maybe has the strongest thoughts, is this much ado about nothing, or do you look at the fight differently or Masvidal differently after these accusations?
No, because there's no. I mean, look, you have to stand in front of on the prep point in front of a commission official who checks your nails, make sure that everything's good to go. They feel you, make sure about the lotion on the Vaseline on your face, and that anything's okay going in. He passed that test. Man, take your win, Burns. You beat, you fought great. Take your win. I don't see it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think if Burns would have lost or something, then I think this definitely could have been a bigger deal. But look, Masvidal is walking away. He retired. Burns, you got the win. I mean, what is that going to change, right?
Yeah, nothing like a good old greasing accusation. It throws me back to the old school days of MMA, GSP, BJ Penn. Let's go. But we'll move on, guys. Topic 3 here, and sticking with Gilbert Burns, he was not shy in the aftermath of beating Jorge Masvidal at UFC 287. The Brazilian issued an ultimatum to the UFC brass at the post-fight press conference, demanding that he get the backup role for the planned Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington title fight to ensure that he gets a shot against the winner, since apparently with Colby Covington, that is now the precedent. If you're the backup, you get the title shot. So UFC president Dana White was kind of informed of this demand at his turn at the press conference, and he obliged, which is great news if you're Gilbert Burns. Probably not such great news if you're Bilal Muhammad, but nevertheless, good for Burns. I want to ask you first, is having Burns as the backup for this title fight, which it seems like despite all the resistance and stuff, we are probably going to get Edwards versus Covington. Is this the right way to play things out at welterweight, or does something else make more sense?
I don't know that it's the right play. I mean, this is starting to become like a comedy sitcom with Bilal Muhammad. There's got to be something we don't know, because that's the right name. I got to give Gilbert Burns props though for asking. He took initiative, and I have to give Dana props for actually accepting. How many times we hear, "I don't do this, I'm fighting, I don't do that." So you can't blame Gilbert for trying. I like the fact that he's in the backup role. I just don't like the fact that he's guaranteed a shot. I don't like that going forward, and we're seeing that here and there. But I will say this: look, more than half of the people that accept this role as the backup, I don't think they give you 100%. It's a title fight. It's difficult to train for these fights. So to say that a fighter's out there doing everything they could, knowing that there's a very good possibility they're not going to fight, I don't think a lot of people take that too seriously. But a guy like Gilbert Burns, he's cut from a different cloth, guys. And I do really think that this is a guy that's going to train his ass off for that moment. The scary part for me is, how do we interpret that moment? Because if you look at Leon Edwards' history, he's probably more likely to not show up than Colby Covington. And if he doesn't show up, what does that do to that fight? Right? Gilbert Burns and Colby Covington now becomes an interim fight. What does that do to the landscape of the division? I think this is one time where I kind of wish Dana would have taken a little bit more time to think this one over, because this could be, no pun intended, absolute chaos.
Yes, and I don't see why you don't just do Gilbert Burns versus Bilal Muhammad on that same card, but what do I know? I'm not the UFC matchmaker. But on to Danny, what do you think? I mean, do you think welterweight, this is the right format to stack things up, or do you think Gilbert Burns, because he asked, maybe skip the queue a little bit here?
I think that I don't hate it, because you can't say that Gilbert Burns doesn't deserve it. Like, if you look at his record, this guy does merit a fight for the title. It just so happens to be that there are other guys that merit a title shot as well in that division. So I wouldn't say he isn't deserving. So I don't hate this idea that Dana White's already putting him as next in line. But obviously, yeah, we got to recognize Bilal Muhammad here. He has done the work. I believe he's on like 8-fight winning streak or 9-fight winning streak. And he is deserving of a shot as well. I like your idea, Mike. I think this fight should be on that same card, Bilal Muhammad versus Gilbert Burns. And you can make Burns the official backup, saying if something were to happen, sorry, Bilal, Burns is going to go in there and fight whoever, does make it to the fight. But yeah, I do think both these guys need one more fight. So why not fight each other and then go on for the title? But whatever. It seems like the UFC, this UFC is already looking at Burns as the backup, and then after that, he's fighting for the title shot. So I don't hate it. Again, I do think Burns is deserving, coming off a big win. So not the worst thing in the world, but it does suck for Bilal Muhammad because he's definitely put in the work and he's deserving of, at the very least, a #1 contender fight against one of the top guys in the division.
Yeah, and I guess close it out with you here, George. I mean, like, Gilbert Burns, to his credit, as Goes kind of said off the top, like he was bold about this. He said, if you don't give it to me, release me from the UFC. So he held their feet to the fire with this one and got what he wanted. But should the UFC have obliged to that in that scenario, or been like, hey, this is what we want to do with you that makes more sense?
I appreciate everything Gilbert Burns has done in his career, everything he did on Saturday, and him being vocal about his career and wanting to do what he wants to do. But it just doesn't make any sense because you have Bilal Muhammad, who's on a longer streak out there, right? And I agree with Danny. Put them both as the co-main event and insurance to the main event of Edwards versus Covington. Now, that said, I think it should be Muhammad versus Edwards, but whatever. It looks like it's going to be Covington versus Edwards. So make this the insurance policy, the co-main event, whatever you want to call it. I would disagree with Danny, though. I would make Muhammad the first choice to back up ahead of Burns. No disrespect to Burns, but he's won 2 in a row. Muhammad's on 8 in a row. I just think there's an order to this, and I would be fighting and campaigning for Burns if the opposite were correct. And I don't know what Dana White's thinking, because when it's convenient for him, I don't make fights on the night of the fight. And then when it is convenient, Covington's the man. Come on, how dare you ask? Give me a break. Sergey Pavlovich, he subbed in for he was going to be the sub for Gane and John Jones. I don't see him being talked about. It's Jones versus Stipe that's being talked about. Michael Chandler flew to Abu Dhabi after he signed the contract to be a backup fighter then, but he still had to take the Dan Hooker fight. So it's not automatic. I don't know what Dana's thinking sometimes, man. He must think Ramadan is actually 11 months and 1 month off instead of 1 month and 11 months off. Why can Bilal Muhammad not get a title shot? This guy's actually fought through Ramadan before. Reward your guys. Reward your guys. Reward the ones that are getting done. Reward the ones that are the hot hand to play. Burns can get the winner of that, or Burns can fight Bilal Muhammad. That makes sense. This should be about making sense and rewarding the fighters that have earned their spot.
George, I'm going to shut you down. Stop trying to make sense. Stop coming at people. You're just trying to stir up shit, man. Stop making points.
If you do, I'm going to come after you.
Knock it off. How dare you ask about Holland and Masvidal, even though we showed the dolly on Embedded and the countdown shows and other stuff to glorify. It's part of the story. How dare you ask about something that went down and is getting thousands of shares and thousands of likes? Knock it off.
Yeah, there's never been a fight set up at a press conference between two guys who weren't scheduled to fight each other before. It's never happened. But as we're kind of on this point, I want to ask you guys before we move on, is there any chance that everything we're talking about here like goes up in smoke? Immediately after this event, Leon Edwards tweeted out, Jorge Masvidal fumbled the bag again. No one deserves the title shot. Who should be next? So it's pretty clear, like, he's been resistant to Colby Covington since the moment Dana White came out and said this in London, that he was going to be next. And he's continued to go there. He told Ariel Helwani in their interview that he won't sign the bout agreement if that's presented to him. Like, is there any chance Leon Edwards digs in so deep here that he is able to get Colby Covington out of this #1 contender slot, especially with Dana White saying that they plan to go back to London for a pay-per-view in July, I believe he said. That gives Leon some leverage there. Obviously, they want him in the main event there, defending his title. So does this maybe not pan out the way Dana White and the UFC hopes? Does anyone think that Leon Edwards be able to dig in enough, or will he cave to the UFC's wishes ultimately? Whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
I think he'll cave. I mean, usually the UFC gets what they want, right? Rarely do we see a fighter get their way and have the UFC change their plans because the fighter wants this or that, right? But I would say something that we need to mention is that there is a legal issue pending with Colby Covington and Jorge Masvidal. And part of why there's a legal issue there is because Colby Covington is citing that he suffered brain damage because of that alleged attack from Masvidal. And Masvidal, who, spoke a little bit about it on the media day, he's like, well, if he's alleging that, like, how is he asking already for a title fight? I do not understand. So there's also that to keep in mind. So I do leave a little room for that fight not to happen, but I think if it doesn't happen, it's probably more because of these legal circumstances as opposed to Leon Edwards' wish that he does not want to fight Colby Covington. So we'll see. But is it set in stone? I don't think so.
Yeah, the more leverage, the more rubies you have on that belt, the more leverage you start to have, the more the UFC treats you as a partner. I don't think Leon's there yet. He just had his first title defense. It was epic. And the UFC is saying, hey, look, it looks like we're going back to London. Take that W. Take that W. Don't dig your heels in, because the UFC loves to come up with reasons to do an interim title shot and shun a fighter if they want to flex on somebody.
He doesn't have the cards. That's just what it comes down to.
Yeah. He could get more money out of it.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, he does seem to have some of the leverage here, especially with the London plans.
And Covington pays more, right, Mike? I think Covington pays more on the pay-per-view side of things than Burns and Muhammad. He just seems to be, he's done it for longer. And
the only big pay-per-view seller that would have been more than Covington would be if Jorge Masvidal had won, and they could have made that, but that's off the table now. So if you're looking out just for the wallet of Leon Edwards, absolutely the answer is Colby Covington, but is that the most winnable fight for him? Remains to be seen. Interesting times at welterweight, and it has been for a while here. We'll see how it pans forward. But I want to move on to topic 4, which helps us switch gears a little bit away from UFC 287 for now. I want to talk about Francis Ngannou and where things stand with his free agency and how the narrative seems to be shifting a little bit on him over the past week. We had BKFC President David Feldman say at their press conference last week in Las Vegas that Ngannou was asking for unrealistic money after they met. Chael Sonnen, in an interview with George and Goes for MMA Junkie Radio, absolutely roasted Ngannou and how he's handling all this. And then Michael Bisping also said on his podcast that he doesn't know who's managing Ngannou's career, and he thinks the best move is for him to just go back to the UFC if they're willing to open those doors. So, Danny, I ask you first. It's been nearly 3 months to the day since Dana White did that press conference and announced that the UFC and Ngannou had officially cut ties. Here we are, nothing announced for his future. Don't know exactly where things stand. Do you feel like his value is dropping the longer we wait for his next move? And given all these kind of comments from the promoters, fellow fighters, what's your perspective on where things stand with Ngannou's free agency right now?
Yeah, this was a big gamble. I think a lot of people, as soon as he tested free agency, is, oh, now he's finally going to get paid and he's going to get all this money. And but wait a minute, this is unprecedented, right? Like, we've never seen this happen before. So we got to wait and see if there's actually a lot of money to be made outside of the UFC being a top draw, right? A lot of times we look at these boxing purses and people just think that in boxing, fighters just make infinitely way more money, the top guys at least, way more money than UFC, top draws, which there's some truth to that. But also keep in mind, a lot of that money is a lot of Saudi, oil money that they just throw around. And a lot of these events, sometimes they're not profitable. It's just, they just pay big purses to these guys. So it's not necessarily like a great business decision. So is he going to get that? It seems Tyson Fury is, preoccupied with other names. I haven't seen really Anthony Joshua or any other names really talk about Ngannou explicitly, like just specifically about the fight. And then, you get these other organizations saying that his contract or what he wants is a bit too much. Keep in mind, sure, some people complain about fighter pay with the UFC, but it is the most profitable MMA organization out there by a million miles. And we know that they were offering him around $8 million to fight John Jones, which is a pretty big purse. So he might have priced himself out here by going free agent. That remains to be seen, but there's a good chance that he might get less money fighting for his next fight than he otherwise would have if he would have stayed with the UFC. Now, the only thing that I would say in most scenarios, people would be like, well, that's an L, right? But keep in mind, Francis Ngannou didn't do this because of money. Sure, money is important, but at the end of the day, it was about principle. It was about him getting freedom. It was about him kind of having a little bit more control of his career. And if he does get that, which that's very likely wherever he goes, Bellator, PFL, whatever, but makes less money, I mean, that's a win because that's what he set out to do, right? So I guess we'll wait and see if this free agency for Francis Ngannou is a success or not. But it's certainly a little bit worrisome that we're getting farther away from him being labeled as UFC champion because the days go by. John Jones won the belt. And yes, it seems by the day he is losing some value, at least as a top draw, at least as the baddest man on the planet goes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think you hit on an important point there, Danny. Everyone wants to count Francis Ngannou's money and be like, UFC offered this much and this person's going to pay this much. He told me when I interviewed him in Vegas a few days before the Jones Gone fight that, money isn't everything here. He wants his respect. He wants, to be treated right, all that kind of stuff. And that's just as meaningful to him at this point. And that kind of echoes what TL says in the comments here. Even if he gets his money, his legacy is going to suffer. Up to him what's most important here. Obviously, if he's trying to be known as the best MMA fighter, staying in the UFC was the move, but it clearly meant a lot more to him. But these outside options, that seems like there's nothing screaming to us it's the most obvious. So George, I want to know, what do you think the path here is for Ngannou? Do you think his best move is to suck up his ego a little bit and make a phone call to Dana White and try to figure things out with them? Or do you think he's going to continue down his current path and find something out there that works for him?
If the opportunities in boxing have frozen up, and I'm not saying they have, but like Danny said, we just haven't seen, we've seen little light rumors, tremors here and there, but nothing, of substance, right? And the longer that goes, then it appears that financial windfall, the ability to go box and compete in another sport. I almost liken it to Michael Jordan. He wanted to try baseball and he wasn't getting any younger, so now's the time. I think that's what Francis wanted to do. He came up boxing before he became an MMA fighter, and I think he just wants to scratch that itch. But that appears to be drying up, or at least, I don't know. That's just how it looks to me. I don't really follow him close enough to see and follow the boxing landscape close enough to see, what's moving, but you hear the rumors, right? And I just haven't heard anything. I think eventually some Saudi money could bail him out. They could have some big fight against one of those big guys like Fury, Joshua, or Deontay Wilder. And then, of course, he proves to everybody that he made the right move and then comes back to MMA. But if that's not happening, pick up the phone, fight John Jones. This company's worth $13 billion. We just found out. I'm sure they can add an extra zero. We can have that fight over at Allegiant Stadium sometime this summer.
George, just not giving up on that dream of the Jones versus Ngannou at Allegiant Stadium. You're sticking true to that. But Goes, I want to close things out with you here. We've kind of got the thoughts here of the landscape, but I want to know, looking at what Ngannou is going through here, Nate Diaz, we still haven't heard anything about his next move in terms of, will the Jake Paul fight happen? Will he fight MMA? Who knows? What do you think we're learning about free agency as we see these two marquee names that want out of the UFC so badly so they can take advantage of all these amazing opportunities who are months later have nothing on the books? What are we learning about free agency through these two?
Well, I think we're learning that if you don't have something already in the works before you leave, you lose a lot of your leverage, right? So both these guys basically left and said, this side of my negotiation is off the table now. So what does the other side say? Well, okay, we don't have to worry about somebody else scooping you up. So now we can fudge the numbers a little bit more. It kind of puts fighters at a disadvantage a little bit. But at the same time, the one thing that Nate and Francis have in common is I think a lot of it didn't have to do with money. I think a lot of it did have to do with freedom and the ability to do other things. I know this has taken a while. This is a process. I mean, guys, if you've ever bought a house, it doesn't happen overnight, right? This is going to be a process. What matters is that final number. Whatever that final number is, that's how we can determine whether or not this was worth it or not. Don't forget, guys, there's a lot of things that come along, not just with that number that you get for fighting, the sponsorships outside of the UFC. Look, crypto, that's beneficial to the UFC, right? That money's not going in Francis Ngannou's pocket. He's not getting howler head money, all right? But in boxing, he can take some of those. And sometimes those sponsorship deals, if you follow some of the other athletes in the world, they get fat checks. It was just a movie about this, right? Air with Michael Jordan, and just one little thing that he put in that contract, and look how much money he makes, right? So let's focus on that last number, whatever that is. And if you're a fighter in this game, you need to root for Francis Ngannou because there's a lot on the line. If he tucks his tail between his legs and comes back, that sends a big message to what the value of the fighters on the roster are versus what the UFC wants to do and their plans, and that will kind of affect future negotiations as well. So I would say focus on that final number, whatever it is. That's what we can kind of dictate whether or not this was worth it for Francis Ngannou.
Yeah, and it remains to be seen. I don't want to jump on the guy or be too harsh. I know he does a lot of his work in the dark, behind the scenes. He's not going to go out there giving updates. But the fact that, fellow fighters, Chael Sonnen and Bisping saying stuff is one thing. But when you have the promoters starting to come out and say some of the stuff they are, Scott Coker, David Feldman, that's when it starts to become a little bit more concerning for me. So we'll continue monitoring it, and I'm sure we'll be talking about Francis Ngannou many more times on the show. But I want to move on to topic 5 now to close things out for our top 5. And we are moving on to some fight announcement news. The UFC is finally returning to Canada June 10th with UFC 289 in my hometown of Vancouver. Excited to go home. But the main event will be a women's bantamweight trilogy bout between Amanda Nunes and Julianna Peña. And this is being met with some mixed reaction, guys. I mean, I think we knew that this was an option for Nunes, but we didn't know what it was going to be for sure next. So I want to know what your guys' reaction to them moving forward with this trilogy is, the level of excitement, and do you feel like this was the right way to go? George, let's get your thoughts first.
Yeah, I'm not excited about this fight. The first fight was a clear fight of a champion that had done it for such a long time and just didn't show up. Julianna Peña, it doesn't make her I'm not calling her a tomato can or nothing like that. She rose to the occasion and she got the title, and she did a number on Amanda Nunes. But when Amanda Nunes came back and made we'll call them adjustments, right? I mean, she just toasted up Julianna Peña. And so, look, they are 1-1, to be fair. They are 1-1. But this is a case, again, where Peña needs to probably do what we are asking of Alex Tejeda. Go beat someone else and then show us that you got something for the champ while the champ fights someone she hasn't fought before, or gives an opportunity to someone that she has fought before but earned her way back. I'm just not interested in it, because fight number 2 didn't leave me anything that led me to believe, oh boy, I want to see another round like this. And whereas Alex Tejeda won round 1 and looked like he was maybe going to win round 2, as he was stalking Izzy, and then Izzy, of course, landed those big shots to end the fight. No, this fight, it doesn't do it for me. I hope it's not even the main event. I hope it's maybe the co-main event, because I don't think that's fair to whatever city landed this gig. I think it was Vancouver in the end that landed this show. But no, I don't like it one bit.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's unfortunate. Kind of this June pay-per-view has been historically like a bit of a rough one in the UFC schedule, just because it's right before International Fight Week, where they're obviously saving their best stuff for. We did get the fight of the year last year out of the June pay-per-view with Yuri Prochazka and Gilbert Teixeira, but I don't think that was necessarily the intent when they booked it. So I guess we'll move on to you, Danny. Do you like this fight, and was it the right one to make?
You're telling me that an immediate trilogy between Amanda Nunes and Julianna Peña makes all the sense in the world, and you got to book it, but not Pereira versus Adesanya? I don't know. Seems off to me, but whatever. I think Irene Aldana should have been fighting in this slot. I think she had a crazy back heel up kick TKO win against Macy Chiasson. She's been looking good. Mexico's on fire right now. I think it would have been a great move, as well as just to keep nurturing and making that market even bigger, which we know that Dana White has been determined to grow that market for years, and finally it's flourishing. Well, Irene Aldana, guess what? She's part of that. I think she should have been fighting for the belt and maybe put Julianna Peña in a number 1 contender fight against another fighter in the division. I don't know, maybe Holly Holm or something. But here we are. So yeah, this is a bit of a head scratcher. I don't understand why they picked Julianna Peña over Irene Aldana, but here we are. I'm just glad that Amanda Nunes is back. I think that division needs to get rolling. I think the title defenses need to add up in the year just to kind of move the division along. I feel like it's been stagnant. So at least that's one thing. That's one good news, that the belt is going to get circulated once again. And remember, she's got 2. So yeah, again, not the best fight, the title fight I've seen put together by the UFC, but sometimes we get these fights.
Goes thumbs up or thumbs down on this fight, and based on your answer, I will get your reaction and ask you something else based on what these guys said.
I think
once
they
we
did
get you back on screen.
I think they did the coup dirty on this one, guys. Look, if this is the main event, they're going to need something very strong underneath it. And one of the issues here is, don't forget, and by the way, here's my thumbs down. Don't forget that if something were to happen to this fight, now what are you left with, right? That's just a terrible situation to be in. I mean, look, GSP and Matt Serra, they were 1-1. Were we all clamoring for a third fight? No, right? I kind of feel the same way here. I'm not saying it can't happen down the road. It just doesn't have to happen right now. The problem is there's just not very many people to give that shot to. And at least if you're going to build a storyline, well, at least you could say this girl beat her one time, right? So I understand where they're coming from, but this card probably shouldn't, this fight shouldn't be a main event, and they probably need more on this card.
Yeah, I mean, they used the last one as a headliner, but yeah, it's not the most attractive thing. I saw one person in the comments, Robert Gerard, saying they have to make the Canadian card better in other areas, and mentions Justin Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier. If you did that as a 5-round co-main event, I think that would maybe satisfy a lot of the ticket buyers and the people. But a trilogy of this, Amanda Nunes, the women's GOAT, you got to put her in main events at some point along the line. But yeah, I think this one just didn't get the strongest reaction. But nevertheless, that is the completion of our top 5 topics. But since we have a few minutes left here, I want to get to at least one of the extras here. And I want to start with a look at this weekend's UFC Kansas City main event, the return of Max Holloway after losing his trilogy fight with Alexander Volkanovski, returns against Arnold Allen, who was on a 9-fight winning streak in the bantamweight, or the featherweight division rather. A huge fight for this weight class, and obviously hugely significant for both guys in terms of what it means for where they stand. But I guess I'll ask you guys first about Max Holloway. How much pressure is on him going into this fight? Like, obviously we know about the rivalry with Volkanovski and where this puts him in the spot, and they're putting him right back in there against like the highest ranked contender who's fighting for his title shot. What does this fight really mean for Max Holloway at this point? Let's go to you first.
Well, for Max Holloway, I think it's the most important fight of his life, right? He has to prove that he still belongs at the top. And it's kind of a win-win for fans, for the UFC, because if he's not up to that challenge, well, then you got a guy like Arnold Allen, who I enjoy watching. He doesn't really say too much on the mic, but he's a good fighter. And you would present a new challenger in this division, right? One that probably needs something. So it's kind of an interesting situation. It's one that we see a lot in the UFC. Can Max Holloway prove that he still deserves to be at the top? Can Arnold Allen prove that his name deserves to be up at the top? Can he take that next jump? That's what makes this fight so compelling.
Yeah, it's super compelling. And Danny, what about you? I mean, what's at stake for Max Holloway here? I think we've seen, we have a date for the Volkanovski versus Yair Rodriguez unifier. It's going to happen International Fight Week in July. If Arnold Allen wins, does he get the winner of that fight? And what happens if Max Holloway wins?
Yeah, if Arnold Allen wins, I mean, a title shot has to come his way. And for Max Holloway, I do feel like he's fighting to either be the Robert Whittaker of 145 or not be, the Jose Aldo of 145. Like, is he going to be the second best and maintain that status and be regarded as the second best in the division? Or are we going to see the case of Jose Aldo where he lost to Volkanovski and Holloway, and we just see, okay, you're just no longer a top guy. Very good guy, but just not longer a top 2-3 guys. So I think he's fighting right here for basically his title dreams. We don't know what's going to happen between Jair and Volkanovski. Obviously, Volkanovski, huge favorite has to be, but the fight still has to happen, right? And Holloway does have a win over Jair, a very exciting and crazy win. So he truly is fighting to keep his title dreams alive in this one. If he loses, you got to imagine it's going to be hard to get back to the top.
Yeah, a lot of pressure on Max, in my opinion, going into this fight. But what about you, George? What are your thoughts on this UFC Kansas City main event and what it means to the featherweight division?
Well, for Max Holloway, he doesn't have a shot at the title as long as Volkanovski's there. That's over. So I think there's less pressure on him. However, like it was stated, he does have the win over Yair Rodriguez. So right now he has to handle his business. Just stick in the win column and see how the chips fall. And hope that there might be an opportunity for you at some point. As far as Arnold Allen goes, geez, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but that's an impressive win streak, an impressive overall record. And if beating Max Holloway doesn't get you next, then I don't even know why we're doing all this stuff here. We might as well just draw names out of a hat. But huge, huge fight. I'm very excited for it. This has the opportunity to be a fight of the year candidate, in my opinion.
Nah, you guys are missing out on one key play. You gotta think like a gangster. Anybody below those guys, throw your name out. I want to be the backup for Volkanovski and Yair.
Exactly.
Boom, title shot.
Exactly. That's the way it goes apparently now. But yeah, I can't wait for this fight. Max Holloway, always a treat to see him compete, and some big changes. He changed management teams in the time between these last two fights. So just curious to see where he's at mentally and how he performs, and if he's able to give us a vintage performance. But we will talk about the result of that fight next week on Spinning Back Clique. But that does it for this week's show. I hope I did okay in the host position for the first time this week. I'm sure we'll be back with whatever panel we assemble next week. Thank you guys. Appreciate everyone who tuned in. Seems like we had maybe some record viewers today. So hope you guys enjoyed the show, and we will see you right back here next week on Spinning Back Clique.